All right. Hey, everyone. I think we're going to get started. We're so excited that you've joined us for the very first Rehabber Club event of 2021 and the kickoff of our 2021 Historic Home Speaker Series. My name is Stephanie Phillips, and I work at the City of San Antonio Office of Historic Preservation, where among the many things that I do, I also help lead the Rehabber Club initiative, which we'll talk about in just a second. Before that, I want to give my colleague Katie a chance to introduce herself because without her, none of this would be possible. So, Katie? Oh no, I can't hear you.
Wow, sorry. There we go. Unmute and video. Sorry. So my name is Katie Totman. I'm a historic preservation specialist with the Office of Historic Preservation. I work with Stephanie, and I am also very excited about this initiative. So thank you all for joining, and let's get started.
Thank you, Katie. And I see we have a large amount of people on the call tonight, which is very exciting. One second. Okay. Just looking through all of the attendees here makes me very excited. Okay, so just a few housekeeping items. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, where you're located, what brought you to this event, please share that so we can see who's all represented here. Feel free to use the question and answer function on WebEx to ask questions. You should see that option in the right-hand corner of your screen. We also encourage you to use the chat. You can drop questions in the chat whenever you would like. If you're also having issues with the WebEx platform, both Katie and I will be in the chat this entire time to help you out. And then after Scott's presentation, we'll moderate a question and answer period. So we're excited to get those questions answered for you too. And lastly, we are recording this webinar and we will be uploading it to the Rehabber Club website in the coming weeks, the one that you see at the bottom of your screen here. So if you were planning on taking diligent notes, you can put those away and rest assured that we'll make this available to you in the future. And Scott, if you can go to the next slide. So before we jump in, I wanted to share a little bit more about the Rehabber Club, which is an initiative of the city's Office of Historic Preservation. It was founded in 2016 with the mission to build and support a network of do-it-yourselfers, craftspeople, contractors, historic homeowners and renters, realtors, and really anyone who is interested in the revitalization of San Antonio's historic buildings or learning more about traditional trades. And we accomplish this mission through training, certification options, community events like this one, networking opportunities, and just plain old encouragement. Some of you that are here that are local to San Antonio may recognize previous Rehabber Club events, including wood window workshops, porch restoration workshops, fun events where we creatively transform reclaimed building materials and turn them into things like coasters or holiday ornaments, plus some of our major volunteer events like Rehabberama. Next slide. So in 2020, we absolutely missed those hands-on community events in person, and we really wanted to make sure that we started hosting more events that kind of shared that same accessible information in the virtual space, which is why we launched the 2021 Historic Home Speaker Series. So over the next year, we'll be meeting monthly to talk about some of the most popular preservation topics that we see in our office, including working with an architect, which you'll hear about in just a moment, sustainable landscaping, wood window repair, plumbing, painting, and more. So if you don't follow us yet on Facebook, I'd definitely check out our page. We recently posted our full list of topics for the entire year, along with the dates that we're planning on holding our series. So you can check that out at facebook.com/SA Rehabber Club. And if you're on Instagram, you can follow our office at SA Preservation, where you will also see information about these webinars and so much more. So we definitely recommend it. Next slide. So on to our main event. As you can tell, we're very excited, but we really are super excited to introduce you all to Scott Carpenter, who's our presenter for this evening. Scott is an amazing architect here in San Antonio, as well as an educator and a historic homeowner himself. He is the Vice President and Principal Architect at Seventh Generation Design, which is a full-service architectural firm with a particular expertise in historic preservation, adaptive reuse, urban infill, sustainable design, and museum and interpretive center design. After 18 years as a senior architect and project manager at Overland Partners, which is another local architecture firm, Scott Carpenter and fellow architect Pam Carpenter founded Seventh Generation Design in 2008. The firm views preservation of our shared cultural resources and adaptive reuse of the existing built environment as a critical facet to integrated approach to sustainable design. Some of the projects that his firm has worked on include the Aztec Theater restoration, the Alameda Theater restoration, the rehabilitation of the St. Anthony Hotel, and extensive renovations at the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library in Austin. Scott is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin with a Bachelor of Architecture and also studied preservation and material conservation at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a registered architect, registered interior designer, a LEED accredited professional, and last but not least, he also serves the community as Vice Chair of the Historic and Design Review Commission, or HDRC. So thank you so much, Scott, for being here. You can take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Katie, very much. Can you all hear me okay? Is the audio all right?
Yes.
Okay, good deal. Well, I really appreciate you all having me here this evening, and it's a little intimidating to be your kickoff for this this program. I'm really glad to see that the series is taking place and that we're not letting circumstances keep us from doing the kind of networking and the kind of expanding of our knowledge base in this particular field. And you know, I just wanted to say I have great admiration for the whole staff at Office of Historic Preservation. I don't think people in San Antonio just realize the level of expertise, professionalism, and dedication that office, the staff there represent. And I've been on the commission off and on for many years and worked with many of them for going on a decade and a half or so. And they're just phenomenal. So I just want to say that, you know, they're a fantastic resource. And so it's one of the things that I want to emphasize this evening in this is that while my talk will be kind of architect-centric, really the architect is a facilitator in many ways of what the project owner's visions are, but also of all the other people that come involved in a project. That includes the craftsmen, the trades, the technical consultants, and the architect is kind of the one that just helps to sort of bundle that all together. So let me move on to the next slide here, I think. Okay, there we go. So I'm just this is going to be a little loose. It's one of those situations where had I had more time, I probably would have a shorter presentation, but so bear with me if this is a little rambling. I'll try to be as concise and leave a good chunk of time at the end for the Q&A, because I think that's the real value of these kinds of events, is to be able to get together and have those discussions and dialogues. And some of the things I want to cover tonight, as I was thinking about what I would say to anyone looking at involving an architect in their rehabilitation project, are some questions that we get asked again and again and again. And so I'll go over some of those that come up quite frequently, but then also talk about you know, what distinguishes sort of an historic preservation architect from, say, any other architect. I'll also talk about a little bit about the historic preservation process, and I'm going to use a couple of projects and the documents, you know, the actual construction documents from those projects to kind of illustrate those. One of the things that this talk is modeled after was a presentation that was done in New Orleans with the preservation group there, and they kind of emphasized, you know, the idea about how does one kind of navigate through the documents and be able to understand what the architect is proposing for a project. So we'll cover a little bit about that. I'll also just talk a little bit about some common pitfalls along the way, and then definitely leave a lot of time for Q&A. So one of the things that often happens to me as an architect is I hear so many people say, oh, you know, I wanted to be an architect at one time, or oh, I took that drafting class and I really enjoyed that, and then I went on to do something else. But you know, you often think about like George Costanza here with his fictitious Art Vandelay, architect extraordinaire. It's, I think, a profession that a lot of people have great admiration for. You know, unlike, say, some other fields that may be a little removed from most of our day-to-day experience, I think a lot of people are aware of the built environment around them. And so there is an awareness and a familiarity to that to say, if I were an astrophysicist, you may not have any kind of idea what I did as for a living. But there's also a lot of misconceptions about architects and their role in the process. And you know, there's also a wide range of architects out there, and both in capability and competence and in experience. And so that's one thing that I want you all to go away with today is that you know, not all architects are made the same. And just like the medical field has specialists, architects have specialists as well. So just a little quick background on the profession itself. In fact, it's one of the first of the three traditional professions: medicine, the law, and architecture were the first fields that were called professions historically. In order to become an architect, you have to finish a bachelor or master's in architecture program. So that can be a 5-year program as a bachelor, which is what I got at UT Austin. But it could be then also a graduate program that you do a 4-year bachelor and then 2-year graduate. Or if you're coming from a completely different field, say philosophy or whatever, you can get a graduate degree in architecture. And that usually takes about 3 years. But all in all, the education is pretty rigorous, and there's a lot of dedication to it, a lot of time. And if you have friends or family members that become architects, have really good photographs of them, because you probably won't see them a lot. As an educator as well, I teach at San Antonio College, and I know my students are the hardest working students there on campus, and that builds and fosters at a very early age a discipline and a passion in what you're doing. You know, following the education, you then go through a minimum of 3 years of experience working under a registered architect. And this goes back to the roots of the profession itself, where before there were registration exams and certifications, it was a field that you became knowledgeable in by working under a master architect. So there's that very much that apprentice mentorship type of relationship as you are a young architect getting out into the field. After that, you then are qualified to be able to sit for the exams. In my day, they only gave them twice a year, and they had to go up to Fort Worth and take them all in a 4-day period of time, 9 different exams. One of them was a design exam that took 12 hours. Nowadays, that has all been digitized, so that they're now distributed in testing centers, and would-be architects can be, they can kind of pace themselves and not have to do it all at one time. Which, you know, in some ways, us old battle wagons, you know, kind of look at that with a bit of a jaundiced eye. You know, it's not quite the trial by fire that we had to go through. But, you know, finally, there's the idea of specialization. And this is something I really want to emphasize, that just like you wouldn't go to your podiatrist for, you know, brain surgery, you don't want to go to, say, an architect that specializes in high-rise multifamily necessarily to do something that is as intricate and potentially complex as a historic preservation project. So those are, you know, something to keep in mind is when we're looking at engaging architects. What is their experience base? What kinds of projects have they done in the past? And because that's really what you're relying upon. You know, many people think about engaging an architect for blueprints. Well, you're really not engaging for blueprints. It's like saying you're engaging a pharmacist for just the pills. So it's like, well, no, you're not just filling a prescription. You know, the pharmacist knows drug interactions, knows things about the effects of pharmaceuticals on the human body, and so you're relying upon that knowledge, that experience base, in addition to fulfilling the prescription. So, you know, what are the qualities of a good architect? I think this is one of the things that makes it such a challenging field, because you have to kind of operate on all lobes of your brain, because it both is analytical, but it's a creative field. You've got to be organized, which not a lot of creative people are organized, and not a lot of analytical people are necessarily creative. So there are some inherent unusual aspects to this. You know, architects tend to be kind of unicorn types. They've got to be good communicators, and you have to have a diverse skill set. You know, at some point, you've got to build a knowledge about things like sustainability, accessibility, material conservation, things like this that all come into play, that it's a wide spectrum of knowledge, codes and life safety issues, and you know, regulatory constraints on a project. And I think one of the things that, particularly in the field of historic preservation and rehabilitation work, is someone who has a good Rolodex, someone who knows people who specialize in particular aspects of the work, having those great resources, because it's such a diverse field. No one person can cover it all, but if you know someone who is an expert in it, you can then draw upon that expertise. Now, when do you have to have an architect? Yeah, you can go to the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners, and they have this lovely flow chart that talks about when you have to have one. And it's generally if it's more than 2 stories and it exceeds a certain square footage, and if it's something that the public uses. So those are all triggers for when you want to engage an architect. But now there are times when you might want to engage an architect. When you've got a project, say like this one, this is in Selma, Texas, right outside of San Antonio, on Harrison Ranch. This is the house of the stagecoach operator, built in 1878. And you know, this was brought to our attention, this property that had 12 acres associated with it, that was actually given to the city of Selma as part of a state grant, but it was under the condition that it be turned into a public park. And so we were asked to go out and take a look at this, and literally it was something that was the only thing that was holding parts of it together were the termites were holding hands. It was a pretty challenging project. So these are the times where you go, you know, you just can't bring anyone, excuse me, to do a project like this. This is an after picture of that, after it was transformed into the public park, and now it is a valued asset of the community, and particularly a community that's been sort of eradicated by the construction of I-35 going right down its main street. It sort of lost its core. So the Harrison house and park has become sort of the new heart of the community. That's really one of the things that Pam and I find very enriching and fulfilling in the particular work that we do, is the effect it has on the community. But these are valued assets. They tell the story of a place that might otherwise disappear in the suburban sprawl between Austin and San Antonio. So how do you find a qualified architect? Well, you can't drive around and find convenient billboards like our personal injury attorneys. You know, really the sources for finding a good architect is, you know, seeking out the work that you admire. You know, if you have a project in mind that you're planning ahead for, you know, look at similar projects that might be out there that might inform you on who your project team should be composed of, not just the architect, but the other craftsmen and trades involved in a project. So that's one thing I would say is, you know, seek out those projects you admire. Now, how do you do that? I mean, going to homes tours, events like this, Rehabber events, all those are ways in which you can build your network and get to know folks that are in the community, that are interested in the same thing you're interested in. You can look at publications and online sources, referrals from trusted sources, friends, family, colleagues who have gone through a rehabilitation project previously and had a positive experience. You can also go to professional affiliations such as the American Institute of Architects. There's a local chapter here in San Antonio, and they've got a directory of architects in the area. They can kind of point you in the direction of qualified architects, particularly if they understand and know what your project is. They can kind of point you in the right direction. And the other way is through community involvement. Who's out there? One of my great idols in the architecture field was Sam Mockbee. And Sam was he was an educator, but he ran something that was called the Rural Studio, where he would take his students out to economically depressed rural communities and working in the community, get people together to help transform them visually, and did really beautiful, delightful work with almost zero budget. And that kind of citizen architect is what Sam called himself. I find that really something I greatly admire. And I think those are the people that, particularly in the field of preservation, are the ones that you want to seek out, because they're the ones that care about your community, the story that your historic property has to tell, and will commit themselves to the work. And I'm sorry, some of these slides, they're a little wordy here. We'll get to some images here in a minute. But, how much can you expect? This is one of those other questions we get asked. How much can you expect to spend for an architect's services? You're not just getting the blueprints, right? You're getting the services, the expertise, the knowledge base, and really think about, particularly for more complex rehabilitation projects, your architect is really serving as your agent. Just like you have an attorney, say, who's closing out an estate or a will, helping the executor of the will go through that whole thing. Same with the architect. The architect is your representative, your agent, and it is up to you to determine how much you want to engage them, how much authority that you want to invest in them. They can have a very limited role, in which case the fees may be fairly small, or that you may have a very hands-off approach to a project and expect your architect to take the lead on a lot of things. So that question about how much you want to expend is something that is very much in your control as a property owner. And the decisions you have to make about that are, how much do you want to be involved? How experienced are you in previous construction projects? What knowledge base do you possess? How much do you want to turn over to the architect to take care of the messy bits? So, for a straightforward, brand new greenfield construction, you can expect that it would be something like 6 to 8% of the construction cost for what they call basic services, which are basically preparing the design, the documents, going through the permitting process, and then doing periodic site visits out to the site. But preservation is not just empty green field. You've got existing conditions you're dealing with, so there's a lot of complexity, and so you begin to see in that where the percentages tend to be a little bit higher. Kind of midway between that, you might have high-end new residential design that could range anywhere from 8 to 12%. And a lot of that has to do with just how complex the design is and how much agency you want the architect to have in the process. But for preservation, it's really on a case-by-case basis. In rehabilitation projects, it may be anywhere from 10 to 15%, depending upon whether it's just reconstructing or rehabilitating what's there versus putting in new additions, and just what kind of qualifying factors might be involved in a project. So that's not an easy question to answer because the answer is it depends. It depends on the particularities of your project. But at least that kind of gives you a bracketing range. Something kind of very mundane, 6%, something very unusual, it might be 15% or more. So there is a range. So one of the things that I think property owners, maybe clients, need to kind of really appreciate is their role in the success of a project. And you know, the architect plays an important role, but the owner is really key. And the planning often occurs long before the architect shows up. And so some of the thinking, some of the dreaming, some of the you know, setting the project goals, if those can be kind of established in your mind clearly before you bring an architect on, the architect can then help you shape those and direct them. But particularly in the case of if it's, say, a husband and wife or business partners, something like that, you want to be unified in the vision for the project. You know, kind of what are you trying to accomplish with this project? You need to be realistic with the goals, the budget, and schedule. You know, there's that classic kind of three-legged stool that comes out of every project where you've got budget, quality, and schedule. And typically you can control two of those, but you can't control all three of them. So you may say, I want it to be low maintenance, you know, fantastic finishes, and that sort of thing. Well, then that's going to have budgetary impacts, and that may also have impacts in how long it takes to design with those materials and to construct it. So depending on what your priorities are, you may or may not be able to control all three of those, and typically you can't. Usually you can control one or two. So often we'll get, you know, someone who says, well, I want it to be low maintenance, but I also want it to be low cost. It's like, well, those are conflicting motivations there, because we understand there's budgets, but if you want it to be low maintenance, that means it needs to be done out of durable, long-lasting materials. That's one of the great things about historic properties, is that they are often frequently constructed of materials that have endured the test of time, and they may be needing some repairs and rehabilitation, but they tend to be much higher quality than what you can get nowadays. It's one of the things that attracts me to preservation as an aspect of sustainability, is the quality of materials. By choosing quality materials to begin with, you're doing something inherently sustainable. So having realistic goals, you know, not saying, okay, we're going to get this thing done in 3 months and on a shoestring budget and expect perfection, right? There's got to be a reality-based approach to the project. You know, finding examples of the architectural projects that kind of relate closely to your project is really a great way of engaging with your architect. And you know, so often we have, you know, our best clients are those that we've been dreaming, thinking about for a long time. And you know, for our residential projects particularly, because it's the most personal design that one can do. You really get to know your clients very intimately, because you're dealing, you know, with where do they like put their toothbrush, and you know, how do the husband and wife, you know, want to deal with each other in the morning or not, and that kind of thing. They're really personal things that you get into, and it begins to border on like marriage counseling at some point at the early planning stages of the project. But if they come together and can agree, often people can agree on the visuals or some key words of a project. Those become things that we then carry forward into the design. So often we'll do like little image sessions with people that will show them images that kind of relate to their project, and ask them to kind of score them and begin to narrow down the ones they don't like. We take out the ones that have potential, we leave in, and we leave those then kind of in a project notebook and use them as a touchstone for the project moving forward. So, you know, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. That's very true when it comes to trying to capture some things, some intangible aspects like the quality of the space, the character of a place. So, you know, start creating that image book for yourself, because that's a great way to engage with your architect. And, you know, I think finally determining how you define success for a project is really critical. That's something that so often I think people forget. They get kind of immersed into the project, all the complexities, the challenges, and things like that. But understanding, at the end of the day, what is a successful project for you, and communicating that clearly to your architect. I think there's a few other things to communicate as well when you first meet, in that very first meeting with your architect. One of them being, how do you prefer to be communicated with? Do you like to be someone who we call you up on the phone, or do you like to have a little summary email shot to you? Little things like that can become a big issue down the line, because construction projects and special rehabilitation projects, there's an inherent stress that you go through, because they involve change and turmoil. They can cost quite a bit. There's a lot of riding on many of the projects, and so this can put things into a very stressful state. So keeping really clear lines of communication, little things like that, are really important in dealing with the architecture, with your architect, your contractor, and the entire project team. So if you're contemplating a rehabilitation project, you're looking for an architect, think about those things in which, what can I do to get organized to most effectively utilize their skills and abilities. So when should you hire an architect? Here is an example of a project that's literally on our boards right now. We're working with OHP. This is over in King William. So this is a project that it's in a well-established historic district, which means there's a lot of very engaged shareholders, stakeholders, I should say. And yes, a significant historic structure. There are challenges with the material condition of the building. All these kinds of things begin to be red flags that you may not want to go it alone. Even though if you were to go back to TDAE's flow chart, this would be one of those that would spit out through the logic gates of the flow chart, or one that you wouldn't need an architect for legally. But it's one of those things because it is a private residence, it's of one story, and it's of a certain square footage, it doesn't qualify. But there are other aspects of projects that begin to make it more of a necessity, or at least a really good idea, to get an architect involved at some level. In fact, this project actually has two architects involved. One is dealing with new construction on the site, and the other one, us, is dealing with all the historic aspects of it. So there's been sort of a division of labor there, really tapping into the capabilities of each of the architects involved. Now I'm going to talk about that as a little bit of a case study, as kind of to depart a little bit from this kind of questions about architects, but sort of go into more of how, as a preservation architect, we approach projects. And one of the really important things is understanding the location and the context of the project. And that context is not just a physical one, it can be a cultural one. In this case, we're looking at its location in the neighborhood. It's right on King William Street. But we also find it very important to go and do as much archival research as possible to understand who owned the property in the past, what documents may be available. In this case, as we were going through the chain of title, what we call a chain of title, where we're building together all of the list of people who owned the property, we go back to the original owner, and he had what was called a mechanics lien, which was basically tied to his loan for building this house. And the mechanics lien was included in the property records at the Bear County. And the mechanics lien lays out in contract fashion everything that the general contractor was required to do for constructing the building. So this became a tremendous resource for us. It's all written out there. And of course, we tested against what was there in the field, because sometimes changes come up and plans are deviated and what have you. But here we found that there was great fidelity with the mechanics lien specifications. And by going through that, we could answer questions like, oh, how tall was the front door? Well, here it says it was 7'6". The front door, the original front door is missing now, and we can look at the framing and go and measure it. And sure enough, the rough opening was appropriate for a 7'6" door with a transom. So when you start getting things like that that are agreeing with each other, you know that you're operating in the context of good preservation practice, that you're not relying upon conjecture or whimsical fantasy about what was there. You're really kind of drawing upon both the physical and the documentary evidence. So this is something that we try to do is to dig into the property as much as possible. The other thing that we do as part of our services, and this is why it's not just a 6% fee, we're really committing ourselves to the mindset of the owner of the property, the original owner that built the thing. And in this case, it was a gentleman who was the editor of the largest German-speaking German language newspaper in Texas. And so he was an immigrant. He was there in King William with many other people of German descent. And we kind of forget that in the early 20th century, German was almost 50% of the people in San Antonio spoke German still. And so it was noteworthy to go back and dig out some of this information about it. And there had been a sort of caloric tale told about that part of the house actually contained the printing presses for the Phillips press. And sure enough, when the floorboards were lifted up, it had an immense joist underneath them that probably supported large printing presses. Other documents that many of you are probably familiar with digging into, if you've done any kind of archival research, is looking at those great Sanborn fire insurance maps. They can tell you an awful lot about the property, what was there originally, or what was there at a particular snapshot in time. In this case, the house was built in 1880, but the closest Sanborn map that we had was from 1896. And but that confirmed a later addition on the structure that we had a separate mechanics lien that was done in 1886. So by kind of piecing all these things together, we can put together a timeline of the development of the property. And we also can kind of get a sense of the context around it at that time as well. Many of the accessory buildings in the neighborhood have gone away over time. They were not as constructed as well as the main houses. And in our case, none of the accessory outbuildings have survived. But we can see that there was a carriage house, a servant's quarter, and a little pretty, all organized along the back of the property right here. And that's also in keeping with the development pattern of the neighborhood. So all these things go to inform, if we were to add on to this, to have new construction, where would we put it? Well, maybe it should go back towards that rear property line. So also, as I said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We look for photographic evidence, and sometimes this is very hard to find, particularly in residential architecture. It's difficult unless there was some kind of event going on right outside, or some family photos that you can get a hold of. Often you don't have it. If they're more like commercial properties, like we're working on the Alameda Theater right now, you can go and find some great photos from the newspaper for parades that went right in front of the Alameda Theater, and there behind it, you can kind of see it at a snapshot in time, what it looked like. So with residential, it's a little bit more difficult to find the photographic evidence. In this case, we really didn't find one until a neighborhood survey that was done in 1971. It was part of a kind of a nationwide push to begin to survey neighborhoods throughout the country that people felt were eligible to be historic districts, or were early historic districts that just hadn't been very well documented. And so in this case, we could already see that the property had undergone a lot of changes and subdivided into 5 apartments. And but just 5 years later, in 1976, we find another photograph. It's been dramatically altered yet again. And so that really helps us to see what's original and what's not, just by looking at those 2 photographs and combining it with the mechanics lien and the physical evidence, things like the ghosts of painted elements that may have been removed, that you can still see impressions in the paint that are there. So we combine this kind of archaeological, archival investigation with on-site physical investigations as well. And all these are things, this is kind of a different skill set than, say, an architect that would be doing your local elementary school design. I wouldn't know how to design an elementary school. The course of my career hasn't gone that way. Just like the podiatrist wouldn't know how to deal with that brain tumor. His specialization's gone down a particular path, and so that's why you want to find a good fit for the folks. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. This is a public project. It's one that we're working on, but I want to kind of show you some of the things, some of the tools that the architects use to communicate a project to their clients prior to it being undertaken. So this is actually for the city of San Antonio, for the Parks and Recs. And this is an older presentation. I think it's been made public, so I don't think I'm giving away state secrets here. But one of the things that is really important, I want to keep emphasizing, is that early planning on a project. Because really from a cost-effective standpoint, you can make big changes early on in a project. If you're in a planning process and you're simply making design changes, yeah, you may be spending a little more in design fees with your architects and engineers or what have you, but that's infinitely more economical to get it right there than get engaged into a restoration, rehabilitation project and in midstream realize, hey, we missed something here. There's a major project objective that was overlooked. And that's when things can really go into the ditch very quickly. So, the reason why I'm showing this is the pump house in Brackenridge Park. Some of you all may be familiar with it. It's sat kind of like a little derelict folly in the park for many, many years. And through the generous contributions of the San Antonio Conservation Society and the 2017 bond, there's finally an impetus to do something with it and to make it, once again, a community amenity. So taking something that was really turning into a ruin very quickly through neglect and bringing it back and having it be something that is something that's of use to the community. So in this case, we're looking at it being like a little concession place where you can get drinks and sandwiches and things like that while you're out enjoying the park, or if you come from the zoo or what have you. But the reason why I show you this is because one of the great tools that technology has brought to the architects is the ability to present your project in 3D renderings. And since architectural drawings in themselves are sort of an abstract representation of the reality of your project, they're often very alienating to lay people. When they look at them, they don't know how to interpret them. But with the ability to have 3D modeling and to be able to spin around a project, we actually find if we invest the time early to do that, we can build consensus on a project much more earlier on, and we can empower our owners, our clients, to feel more confident in the decisions and the directives they're giving us. So these are things that I think are, like every field out there, this is the way in which technology is really helping to influence things. So in this case, you can see the little pump house. It spanned over a raceway, and it had these turbines that would pump water up and send it over to a reservoir at the Botanical Gardens, where the Botanical Gardens are now, and then it would gravity feed to downtown. So it was an amazing feat of civil engineering. But it's this little beautiful structure there that, even though it was just this utilitarian structure, it has quite a bit of beauty and craft to it. But here we're showing the interiors of what it may look like as a little coffee and a sandwich shop type thing. But let me show you just a few other drawings here that represent kind of some of the effort that we put in. This is a site plan and the floor plan. So the floor plan on the lower left there is cut down through the area where the turbines would have been originally, where the water came through the raceway, turn the turbines, run the pumps that would pump the water over to the reservoir. But often people begin to get mystified with architectural drawings as they get more and more complex. So this is a very simple structure. It's pretty easy for most people to understand what's going on here. But there's some drawing conventions that once you understand them, it makes it pretty simple to interpret what's going on there. So in this case, in the left hand drawing, we're down below where the building has been backfilled. So all of this sort of hatched area around it, this sort of basket weave area around it, is representing the earth that is retained by the building. And part of our plans is to take that, excavate that back out and reestablish how the building would have looked like historically, where water would have flowed through and underneath the structure itself. Up at the upper level, you have these 14 windows and 2 big doors, and this is where the pumps would have been located. And these symbols that are floating around it, this one right here is called a section. And think of a section as taking a big butter knife and slicing it vertically through the building. And if you were to look at the structure that way, this is how you would see it. Okay. A plan is basically taking a big butter knife and slicing it through horizontally. Okay. And the convention is for most plans is that you cut it through at about 4 feet height through a space. So anything that is at about 4 feet or below will show up in the plan. Anything above it might show up as dashed lines to suggest that there's something above. So in this case, we have 2 trusses that go across the middle of this thing, and they're dashed here in this plan to let you know, hey, there's something important going on above that. The other important drawing type, these are all kind of collectively called orthogonal drawings, is the or orthographic drawings, or the elevations. So elevations are basically drawings of the building's facade. Okay, and the facade is the face of the building, the exterior or the interior. So we have back at the previous image here, we have these are interior elevations, and then at this location, there may be a little bit of a lag. At these locations, we have 4 exterior, and each one of these have little numbers on them that relate you to then the sheet that they're on. So here are those elevations for that building. And we took a lot of time drawing this. Turned out there was also historic American building survey drawings that were done by students at UTSA under the direction of one of their instructors there. And we acquired those as well and used that as a double check to see if we caught everything, and also to see if there had been any movement in the structure since the time it had been recorded. So in this case, we've sliced right through the raceway, and this symbol right here is telling us that there's another slice going the other direction, and that's what this one is right here. So we're looking through the raceway and also the pump house proper up above. So those are all really simple drawings, but then what we do as well is we do kind of well, these are a few others that I might mention. In addition to plan, section, and elevation, there's also reflected ceiling plans. It gets its name from, if you were to imagine putting mirrors all on the floor and looking down the mirror, what would you see directly above? So in this case, we're up in the pump house again, and we can see 2 little trusses that are going across right here at this location. And there's other call outs that tell us about other drawings that are within the set. Now, this was a preliminary schematic set. This isn't our final construction documents. But one of the things that we wanted to do in learning up about this property is not only the archival information and looking for photographs and drawings and documents and things like that, we also did measure drawings of the structure, and then also assessed its physical condition. I often liken historic preservation and restoration work to to kind of much like when you go to a physician, they don't just start telling you what to do, what pills to take and what regimen to do. They do a full workuver of your blood, a physical examination, the whole bit. And preservation is a lot like that as well. To rehabilitate a structure like this, you need to have the history, the background, just like the patient's medical history. But you also need to kind of do an assessment of its physical condition right now and make some assumptions about where it might be heading if nothing is done. And so in this case, we are graphically depicting, there's a legend over here where we have various conditions. Like red is where something's completely missing or where there are cracks or things like that. And so we graphically depict this so that our clients, in this case, it's people, staff with the San Antonio Parks people, they're not material conservationists or preservation specialists, but when you put it in a graphic form like this, just about anyone can say, oh, yeah, there's a big wicked crack here. We've got to do something about it. It really begins to pinpoint where some points of concern are and lets people know kind of where we need to go with our work. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly go through these because I want to leave time for Q&A. I showed you that one project in Selma. I'm just going to show you a more complex set of documents than the pump house. The pump house, those were very conceptual and were prepared in what we call a schematic design phase. So the schematic design phase is where you're kind of getting the overall parameters of the project together. Design development is where you start doing more of the detailing of it. Construction documents are when you are getting into more of the technical documents, including specifications and more detailed drawings, code analysis and things like that. And then finally, there is the actual construction of the project once it's gone out, either to bids or you've brought on a contractor who has negotiated the cost of construction with you. So I'm going to show you an example of a more complex set of documents. Now, all of these I'm showing you, I know this group often is more residentially oriented. These happen to be under city ownership, but they were originally residences or they were originally kind of small scale structures. So I think they're still applicable in scale. But in this case, there's the Harrison Park, and it's buried way off from where the actual historic stagecoach is. It's back behind, unfortunately, there was this development of kind of suburban track homes that pushed it right up against the Cibolo River. I wish they had given more of a margin, a buffer zone around it. But we've gone through, I guess, about 4 phases. This is a head-on picture similar to that one that we saw earlier, where it had a cyclone fence around it. It had been vandalized and set to rot for a while. But I wanted to show you some more complex drawings. In this case, the building had a core that was built in the 1870s, and then in the early 20th century had 2 wings added on either side of that, and a front porch that then runs down the south facade of it. And this is one of the most important documents in a rehabilitation set to prepare. This is the selective demolition set. And this is where you really define what stays and what needs to go, either due to deterioration or it's a later addition, something that doesn't have historical integrity or lacks structural integrity. And so in this case, this is talking about sort of what goes away. And the convention is for a demolition drawing like this is where anything that's dashed, like this whole front porch was very deteriorated. That is going to be removed. And these little diamond-shaped symbols here relate to a whole list of detailed instructions about whether an element is to be salvaged and then replaced, or whether it is to be taken away completely, etc. So this is a really critical document as you're looking at your historic property and analyzing, what is significant about it. This is one of the more important drawings that you can put together. Often the roofs are one of the first things you want to be dealing with, getting the foundation stabilized and getting a good roof on a structure, and then letting the rest in between take care of itself. But here in this case, this structure actually had cypress shakes underneath it, underneath a later metal roof. And so we needed to take away the deteriorating metal roof, and we actually salvaged all the cypress shakes, and then those were used by the city to hand out to members of the community as kind of a little token when there was a ribbon cutting for this thing. We couldn't really make use of the cypress because it was already kind of deteriorated. It was pretty amazing that it had its original roof on it. We incorporate photographs directly into the construction documents, and we annotate those. This is particularly important if you're dealing with a kind of a bid situation where you've got multiple contractors bidding on something, because you really want to let them see the property, take them out there, allow them to walk through it. And ideally, if there's some demolition to be done that can uncover some concealed conditions, say you're taking away elements that are later day or deteriorating or what have you, if you can have a preliminary phase that you're removing those so that then your contractor can come out and see it in its more cleaned up state, it takes the fear factor out of their estimating, because they can visually see what the conditions are. But we incorporate those in our documents as well to help document it. And those are both interior and exterior images that we incorporate, taking images of every wall in the space, and even up in the attics, so that you can really have a good record of what it was like prior to the rehabilitation. I won't go through all of these because it would bore you. You guys can't see them, but a lot of more technical information gets organized into what we call schedules. Things like door types, mechanical equipment is often schedulized, window types, things like that. And so that's basically charts or spreadsheets that contain all the particulars about a door, a window, or a piece of mechanical equipment. The door will have its height, its width, the thickness of the panel type, the frame type, those kinds of information go into a door schedule. In this case, we had an extensive site that was being developed as well. But I wanted to take you to this very quickly, and then I'm going to jump to our Q&A. But here's an example of kind of a fully fleshed out floor plan for the construction set. And it begins to get pretty dense in the amount of information. If you think back to that simple pump house, there's all the same kind of symbols here, where we can see there's an overall section where you're taking that butter knife and cutting it right through the middle of the structure. And then there's another one at 90 degrees to that. We call this a transverse, and this is a longitudinal section. Longitudinal meaning along the long grain of the structure. Transverse means going across the short direction of it. And so you can see this one goes all the way through the front porch, through that central room, through the back room, back out again. There was also the need to have modern restroom facilities. And so we held that off as a separate structure, connected to the main house through sort of a dog trot, kind of picking up on the vernacular language of the architecture, wrapping the porch around, but also integrating in an accessible ramp so that the public could make use of that. So all those are kind of complex things to integrate into a piece of historic architecture and within an historic site like this. But I wanted to give you kind of a sort of a taste for, as these documents get layered up, really the fundamentals are still there. There's just maybe more annotation and that kind of stuff. And so as you're working with your architect, you'll see that your drawings develop over time, and you can begin to kind of selectively visually shut off aspects of that information and look at exactly what you want to look at. Like, okay, where are the sections? Where are the elevations? What are these bubbles here? Well, these are calling out each individual column so that every column is identified on a grid. So there's a grid going this way, and then there's another grid going this way. And we had to reconstruct that whole porch. So once you kind of get the fundamental language of hieroglyphics that architects use, it becomes a lot easier, a lot friendlier to deal with. But remember, those 3D drawings are always really nice. I think I'm going to go ahead and cut to the end here at this point, but I think you guys kind of get a sense about with these, how the drawings begin to develop. And then let me jump right to the very end, and I'll get this slide up. So I've kind of focused on that sort of front end part of this, about that importance of planning, of having the project priorities set up, kind of knowing what your goals are, even before you get the architect involved. And then I've taken you through kind of a little bit of what the architect does and kind of the documents they produce. But all of these are simply means to an end. And the next phase would be to take those documents then and to find a contractor. Now, often we try to do that earlier on in the phases of the project, so that we're getting not only kind of real market dollars, but also constructability input from the contractor. So we tend to try to work very collaboratively with the builder or contractor, and encourage the owner to find them as soon as possible, because that helps to begin to build that relationship. It can be, as I said, a very stressful process, and you need to build that trust early on in the process. And if you can bring in the contractor and they can begin to understand what the goals of the project are as well, they can also be then an advocate for the project with their subcontractors. And when things go awry, they can be sort of be involved in the problem-solving aspects of the process as well. So, you often hear about this sort of antipathy between architects and general contractors. That hasn't been our case at all. We really value our relationships and our engagements with the contractors. They're the ones that finally have to execute the work, and it's a challenge, because you talk about all this training, knowledge, and information, and it's being filtered through the abstract means of written specifications and drawings, to ultimately down to someone that may have very little education, but they are still maybe a master at what they do. You've got to respect that, and you've got to meet them where they're at, and listen to them if you got a better way of doing it. And so I think as architects, as a profession, we can be a lot more humble, and not also look outside of our discipline. Know when there might be someone who has a better take on something. So with that, I'll turn it over to Q&A. I'm sorry if I went a little long on the presentation here.
That was wonderful, Scott. Thank you. We did get a lot of fantastic questions in the chat, and Katie and I are going to kind of rapid fire them to you. So we'll jump right into the first one. And this first one I want you to answer. It's not explicitly related to the work of an architect, but it looks like we do have a lot of people that are on the call that are interested in kind of you becoming an architect. So this first question is, do you recommend going straight into a Master of Architecture or take a gap year and gain experience through an internship?
Well, I can speak to my own experience. As I was going as an undergraduate, every summer I'd go home and live in my parents' back bedroom, mooch off of them, and I had a summer job working for an architect who actually, this is when my dad was stationed at Fort Hood. He was in the Air Force, and this architect had done a lot of very large projects in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and had kind of gone into semi-retirement. But he was doing a few kind of community public libraries and things like that, small-scale stuff. And at the time, I was an art major. I wasn't even in architecture. But I went to him, I was interested in architecture, and he saw my portfolio, and it turned out he was a master watercolorist and renderer himself. So I kind of lucked out. I went to someone who had sympathies for artists and that sort of thing. And he then hired me to do just some really basic, at that time there was no computer drawing going on, some very basic drafting. And I worked on the Harker Heights Public Library and a few other projects, did them all summer long under his direction. And so it was very much that kind of old world mentor, apprentice kind of a relationship. And I found that hugely valuable, so that when I went back to school and I did start doing my design studios and other architecture classes, I had a frame of reference that was grounded in the real world about how the profession of architecture really works, and could relate that better to what I was doing and learning, in school. And so I would really encourage, whenever you got an interest in anything, jump in with both feet and find people that you admire and go and suck their brains. Just dive in and get as much information as you can. And I think that's also important. If you're if you have an undergraduate in something else other than architecture, and you're thinking about going into graduate school in architecture, graduate school is not the place to go find yourself. It is really the place to perfect the course of where you're headed. And I think it would be really great if you're looking at going between an undergraduate program and something unrelated to architecture into architecture. I'd definitely say go and try to, even if you're just running copies and taking out trash or whatever, just being in the professional environment, you can absorb so much through osmosis, and you also begin to establish your professional network that way as well before you get out of school. And that's always really important. It's easier to go and try to get a job with someone you've already worked for than to throw your resume in on a pile of a bunch of other people and they don't know who you are. So I would say yes, absolutely, go and do it. And then that will confirm whether you really want to commit 3 years and all the money of graduate school to doing architecture. We'll take a quick break.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. Here is another one. You mentioned how architects are specialists. What are some good questions to ask architects when folks are interviewing to ensure that they have the skill of a preservation architect? In other words, how can owners determine whether an architect has historic preservation credentials?
Yeah, I think one of the best things to do is ask them for their portfolio or some kind of rundown on their experience. Nowadays, everyone kind of does a sort of passive drive-by of people that they're looking at hiring on their website. I'm ashamed to say that Pam and I have been so busy, and since we started our career, we've never gotten our website up and going. It's been fits and starts, and we really haven't needed it. But that is one of the emerging ways in which you can kind of passively go and check out someone before you even call them, and they'll have sort of an online portfolio of their work. But looking at examples of the work, getting references from them, of former clients. I think in some cases we've had potential clients ask us to go and actually see some of the projects we've done, and we've managed to have really great relationships with the clients, and they've tended to become good friends of ours, and so they know the essential importance of being able to promote your previous work in order to get future work, and so they've been advocates for us for our future clients. So I think that's one way of gauging it, is kind of looking at what they've done before. As far as kind of an interview process, I think some of the things to ask them is how have they dealt with difficulties in projects in the past? When something has gone awry, what has been their method of solving it? Because construction in general, and preservation in particular, there's so much that can go wrong. And it's really, how does one adapt to that? How does one respond to that and keep the wheels on the cart I think are really important to understand. And I think the final thing in that interview process is ask yourself, is this someone I can work with? For the next year, or in some cases we have projects that go 3.5 years or what have you. Know that you're going to be spending some time with these people. And if they're irritating and grating and obnoxious and aren't listening to you, and if they're doing more talking than listening, then these should all be red flags to say, maybe I ought to keep looking for someone else.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you, Scott. Kind of related to once you select that architect and you're moving forward, how do you recommend scheduling multiple phases of a historic home rehab? As a historic homeowner myself, I think I see different parts of my house as we'll do this at one point and we'll do this at another point. How do you recommend that homeowners approach that if they're planning on engaging an architect?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's part of that kind of early on front end effort and planning that I was talking about is so important. And what I would recommend if you're looking at trying to, and I'm a historic homeowner as well, and I'm sitting here, it's the cobbler's kids have no shoes. I'm sitting here going, how am I going to get this thing rehabilitated? I'm going to have to do it in bite-sized chunks. And I think what is critical to that is doing it in as logical a fashion as possible, and is in a cost-effective fashion as possible. And so I would recommend, if you're looking at doing something in sort of multiple phases over a long period of time, is step back and kind of assess what you have to work with and understand where are the priorities, what is the historic property, excuse me, what is it crying out for? Because it's going to set some of the priorities for you. And just like that patient that goes to the doctor, the doctor's got to listen to that raspy breathing and think, well, maybe I need to investigate this a little bit more. The same with looking at your historic home is sort of identify where are the preservation priorities. What are things that are critical to its long-term health, that if you don't address, anything else might be time and money wasted that you might have to go back and undo to then address a more major issue. So what we often do when we meet with clients that have that kind of situation where they're thinking about doing it over multiple phases, we'll say, let's do a master plan. Let's sit down and figure out what those priorities are, and then come up with a logical sequence of how to address them, so that you're not going back and having to undo stuff, and that you're also addressing things that are critical in the right order. And by just investing a little bit more time and planning up front, that then can set up a master plan that you need to follow. And that takes out kind of the fear and anxiety. It's like, I have a plan now. I know where I'm going with this. And this is going to happen, in a year's time, and we're going to be saving the money to do that. And then in 2 years' time, we're going to do this, and so on. But you know that you're not getting yourself in a situation where you're ignoring some critical priorities in order to do something, say, more cosmetic. Now, it's tough, particularly, and this was a condition of that we had to look at when we were looking at buying a historic home. We knew we were going to have to do it in kind of phases, just because economic realities. So we couldn't purchase something that was such a wreck that it was just like camping the whole time we were there until we got things fixed. But if you are in a situation, particularly if you're looking to have to take a kitchen offline for a while, then you'll have to look at, well, where can we create a makeshift kitchen? We have this with a case in a project that we did in Monte Vista, where the major heart of the project actually was the kitchen, but it was a severe gutting out. And these were for a client that they were like gourmet chefs, they were really big foodies. And so to imagine taking the kitchen offline for what turned out to be over 2 years, because it wasn't just the kitchen, it was a whole lot of additions and what have you. It was a major hardship. And so they did end up having to kind of camp out for a while, but they made really good use of a particular space and set up makeshift sink and everything else, and so they kind of made it work. But whenever you're looking at a situation where there's major work going on, if you're still going to be living there, protecting your furniture and your belongings and all that kind of stuff, and knowing if the building is going to be torn open for a while, subject to the elements and all that, it takes a lot of very careful planning. So that's why you want to go back to that master plan. And even if that means that you, in the master plan, you say, okay, this is a major medical thing that we've got to do. And we can either screw around and do it piecemeal, or maybe we go rent a little two-bedroom house somewhere and go and deal with this. And so they pull up the floorboards, put in the new foundation, and then you can come back and catch your breath and then go on to the next phase. So sometimes you have to kind of bite the bullet and do something like that, but there may be a more cost-effective way of doing it rather than limping along and trying to camp out in it. So there are a lot of complexities that come along with that when you're looking at multiple-phase projects. So the answer, in short, is have a plan, a master plan, that then informs every chunk of work that you do afterwards. And I'll try to be more succinct.
So the next question is, so as you know, Scott, many of the historic districts have neighborhood associations. As an architect, how best, do you engage them, or, what's the best way to approach those folks, with a project?
Yeah, and that's very dependent upon which neighborhood you're talking about, because we have a weird peculiarity in San Antonio that some neighborhoods have multiple neighborhood associations. And there's sometimes reasons why they have multiple neighborhood associations. And you've got to be kind of conscious of the lay of the land, and who you're dealing with on that. But say in a more normal situation, most of the neighborhoods just have one association that's organized. And I think the key there is to treat them as stakeholders in the project. And while the property owner they're your client, they're also in some ways a steward of the property. And some of our best clients have understood that their history with property is going to be finite, and that something's happened before and things are going to happen after, and that they want to have a positive impact on that. But to know that there are other people that are part of that larger timeline as well, people that have lived in the neighborhood for generations. And so I think respecting that, knowing that sometimes if you're new to that neighborhood, say you just purchased property, you don't know those folks, that can be actually the opportunity to get to know your neighbors, is to say, hey, I really love your neighborhood. This is the reason why I purchased this. I want to understand what were the stories. You guys hung out here as kids. Begin to engage them on a really personal level, because they have a personal investment in that. They may not have a financial investment, they do have a personal and cultural investment, and you want to respect that. So from a more regulatory standpoint, I would say engage your neighborhood associations at the same time you do OHP, and maybe even a little before. Sometimes we go to the neighborhood associations, kind of sound them out to try to understand what resistance we might face on our project, get their input on something. And then we go to OHP and say, well, this is what we'll propose the project. And we'll already tell them we have started that stakeholder engagement process. And here's the feedback that we're trying to incorporate. OHP staff, what do you think about that? And really kind of work both those channels simultaneously rather than sequentially, because I think you can kind of get yourself in a whiplash. And you work very intensely with the neighborhood association and then go to OHP. You may get some conflicting information, and part of that's just because people are looking at it from very different vantage points in many ways. So I think you get a more holistic approach if you engage all the stakeholders, both at the neighborhood level, at the city level, at the same time, and treat that as part of the context of the project you're designing. I think it's one thing that non-preservation architects don't get. And I'm working on with one right now who's sort of amazed at the whole process of having to go through OHP and that kind of stuff. And I told him, well, you know, I'm kind of used to it because I just treat it as part of the context. Just like the sun comes up in the east, sets in the west, you know, prevailing winds are in the southeast. You know, it just becomes the environment in which the project is being conducted. And don't try to fight the sun coming up in the east, because it's not going to work. Understand that process and design accordingly to it.
That's great feedback, Scott. Thank you. I have a pretty quick question. For your firm, if someone were to reach out to interview you or discuss a project or potentially see if you could come out to take a look at what they're proposing, how quick is an appointment turnaround if someone reaches out to you?
Yeah, that's a real dependent. It depends on what's going on that week, and you know, generally, right now, since we're working it from home primarily, you can see my house behind me. You know, we do a lot of our daily meetings online, but you know, we'll go out to the site, you know, several times during the week, you know, for what we call a go-see, and yeah, I think just a couple of days notice, you know, to get everyone's schedules lined up. It's not that tough these days to do that. You know, and I think that's always really good if you can kind of start out at the site, looking at what the issues are, and we're always happy to, you know, help people out, even if you don't hire us, it's just to give you some direction on where you're headed with your project. Because we want to see people succeed, not flounder around. I mean, I feel like I'm a stakeholder, you know, as a commissioner on HDRC. You know, most of the projects that I deal with, particularly when I used to live in Alamo Heights, weren't in my district, you know, but I still felt strongly and passionately about those that were not in my district, and you know, so I want to be that citizen architect that I guys mentioned earlier, that Sam Mockbee was my real hero. And part of that is just trying to be as helpful to my community as possible. So if you've got a project that you're thinking about, even if it's, you know, a ways out, let's get together and, you know, talk about it and see what the feasibility is of it.
All right, let's see. The next question, Scott, is when you do renovation projects, do you work with a general contractor to manage your subcontractors, or are you, as an architect, supervising those subcontractors, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, that's very client dependent. So we have some clients that have a lot of construction experience in the past. They've been developers or contractors themselves, and in which case we will do a very limited set of documents and then come out periodically to make sure things are on course and to interpret and, you know, address questions as they come up. Generally, we're not in the process of kind of doing like a design build, you know, where we're calling up the subcontractors and scheduling them to come out to the site and things like that. That's not the role that we play. There are other architects that have that as part of their practice. We just simply have too much on our plate right now to be able to do that. It's a big time commitment for playing that role, that kind of air traffic controller for a project, to make sure all the subs are showing up, the sequencing is taking place. And that's why I have great admiration for what contractors and general contractors do, because it's not easy what they're doing. But what we tend to do is kind of in two ranges. Either we're serving a more limited role, where we're developing the design and then handing it over to an experienced client who's gone through the construction process before, knows what they're getting into, or we do a more full services where if someone is a little less confident about that, hasn't gone through that process, or simply are too busy in their life to be engaged with the contractor on a regular basis, So we'll have a more hands-on involvement like that. But we're not doing, contracting and subcontracting. We're playing the role of architect.
Thank you. And we have one last question. We weren't able to get to all of them today, so I dropped a note in the chat. If you have any additional questions or if any pop up after this event as you're mulling over this great information, feel free to email us at info@sapreservation.com and we'll get you those answers. So the last one is a really fun one, which is why I saved it for last. Scott, what is the strangest thing you found in the walls or the attic of an old house or property?
Oh, God. Well, living or dead?
Or
this can get kind of grotesque. Pam fusses at me for getting her involved in preservation because I was the one who was really passionate about it. And it's, we think of it as this genteel pursuit, but you can get into some really gross, nasty things that you find in things. Unfortunately, I haven't been so lucky to find like an unknown copy of the Declaration of Independence or a foot locker filled with Spanish gold or anything like that. So I haven't found anything quite that exciting. So what's the weirdest thing I've ever found? I don't know. I'm talking about that Selma project. There was a family of about 8 raccoons living in the attic, and they would crawl up through the walls. And one day I was out there doing some exploratory, tapping around on the walls and everything, and suddenly the walls started growling back at me. And I didn't realize there was a cavity that they actually used as kind of a conduit right next to where the chimney went up through the attic. That's how they were coming in underneath the raised pier and beam foundation and finding their way into the attic. But there was a big mama raccoon right there in the wall that I was about to take the drill to and do some exploratory. But she told me to stand back and to think twice about it. It was pretty scary.
that certainly is memorable, and I'm really jealous because I think raccoons are the cutest thing ever, even though I know that they're like basically crazy like cats. It's fine.
They're cute, but they can also turn vicious really fast. You can start drilling it into a wall right next to them.
Yes, that's certainly a precarious situation. Well, Scott, we can't thank you enough for offering us up this amazing insight into your long legacy of work here in San Antonio and beyond. So thank you so very much for taking the time to share this with our community. We are going to wrap it up today. And like I said, if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to email us at info@sapreservation.com and we'll get those answered for you. And definitely stay tuned for our next, 11 months of wonderful presentation content focused on historic homes. We'll be sending out a survey after the event to get any additional ideas that you have on topics that you'd like to see discussed. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you all. Stay safe.